Let me lay this out exactly the way I understand it right now, because I think something real is taking shape in Cleveland, and most of the people covering it are missing the actual story underneath the noise. I'm not here to talk about a win-loss record. I'm not here to give you an injury report or run through a depth chart. What I want to talk about today is bigger than that, and honestly, a little harder to look at directly. There's a quarterback battle happening in that building that's turned into one of the most loaded storylines anywhere in football right now. There's a gambling scandal sitting right next to it, involving a young player who had actual skin in the game against his own locker room. There's a legal fight between a major conference and a state's top law enforcement official that's now sitting in front of a federal judge. And there's a 24-year-old kid who has done basically everything right since the day he walked into that facility, while the national conversation about him is still stuck on a version of events that stopped being accurate a long time ago. Here's the part that really gets me, though. None of these stories live in their own little box. Pull on one thread and watch how the others move. This isn't 4 separate headlines. It's one organization standing at a fork in the road, and the decisions being made right now in real time are going to define what that franchise looks like for years. So let's start where the heat actually is, with Shedeur Sanders. And I want to say this carefully, because I think the way the national media has handled him has been close to a disgrace. Not because of hype, not because of his last name, not because of anything tied to his father's name following him out of Colorado and through the draft circus. I'm talking about what has actually been happening behind closed doors at the Browns facility day after day since the moment he arrived. What's happening in that building is not the language you use for a 5th-round flyer. Coaches are talking about footwork corrections that are actually taking hold in real games, not just on the practice script. They're talking about command of a playbook that was supposed to take a rookie a full year to even start to grasp. They're talking about preparation habits that nobody installs through coaching. You either walk in with that internal motor running, or you don't, and he walked in with it running. And the locker room? The locker room is talking about him the way players talk about somebody they actually believe in. Not the polite, careful, diplomatic language reserved for a young guy everyone assumes is gone by the 3rd preseason cut. Real belief. The kind that doesn't show up in a press release. It shows up in how a huddle settles down when a certain guy takes the snap, in how the energy on the practice field shifts depending on who's jogging out there. Now, I want to slow down for a second and actually sit with how ugly the road here was, because I don't think people give it the weight it deserves. This wasn't a normal draft slide. It was public. It was drawn out. It was humiliating in a very specific, very deliberate way. 5th round, not because of medical red flags, not because of anything that showed up on tape from Colorado, where he was playing behind one of the worst offensive lines in the entire sport and still finding ways to thread throws into impossible windows. He fell because of something far murkier, something about how he was perceived, about the noise that surrounded him, about opinions that had hardened in war rooms long before he ever stepped onto a combine field. And where did that fall land him? In Cleveland. A franchise paying out an obscene amount of guaranteed money to its incumbent quarterback. A fan base so scarred by years of disappointment that suspicion is the default emotional setting. A media landscape that had already filed him under developmental project, check back later. And he walked into all of that and made the competition real anyway. This is exactly why what LeGarrette Blount did matters so much to me. He said, out loud, what a lot of football people have apparently been whispering for a while. He put his name behind Shedeur. But what actually stopped me wasn't the endorsement itself. It was the honesty wrapped around it. Blount admitted, on the record, that he had bought into the noise. He absorbed the storyline about entitlement, about character questions, about all the baggage that got strapped to Shedeur's name through the draft process, and it shaped how he initially saw him. And then, and this is the part that almost never happens in sports media, he actually went and looked closer, and he came back and said he'd been wrong. I don't think people appreciate how rare that is anymore. Public self-correction is basically an extinct species in this business, because changing your stance gets treated like weakness, like getting played, like admitting you didn't do your homework the first time. Blount did it anyway, because what he actually saw didn't match what he'd been repeating. He said the character concerns weren't built on anything real. He said what he found, when he actually paid attention to the day-to-day version of Shedeur as a professional, was a guy who takes ownership, who competes without drama, who carries a level of internal discipline that no coaching staff on earth can manufacture from scratch. And then Blount went one step further, with an argument I think deserves real consideration from anyone trying to handicap this competition honestly. That chip on Shedeur's shoulder from the draft slide, it's not baggage, it's fuel. The players who absorb that level of public professional disrespect and come out the other side with fire instead of bitterness, with purpose instead of resentment, those are the ones who end up rewriting what people assumed their ceiling was. Not every single time, but often enough that when you see the early signs lining up, you pay attention. And the conditions surrounding this particular situation are worth examining a little closer, because this isn't a generic young gun chasing the veteran story. Todd Monken runs this offense. He helped build the entire system from the ground up alongside the head coach. And Shedeur isn't just memorizing it, he's improving inside of it, week over week, under the direct supervision of the people who designed it, and who will ultimately be the ones evaluating who gives them the best shot to win. That's not a small detail. A young quarterback climbing rapidly inside a system built by the very coaches judging him is the kind of structural edge that never shows up in a highlight package, but shows up enormously in how internal grades trend across a training camp. So here's where my frustration boils over. While Blount is out there publicly correcting the record based on what he actually saw with his own eyes, you've still got national voices, Jeremy Fowler and others, reaching for that fifth-round label like it's some kind of permanent scarlet letter, still framing Shedeur as a long-shot curiosity instead of a legitimate threat inside a genuinely open competition. And I want to be precise about why that's not just irritating. It actually causes damage. Narrative shapes how a situation gets perceived from the outside, and perception shapes the pressure an organization feels when it's time to make a real decision. If the loudest national voices keep insisting this is a foregone conclusion in favor of the guy with the legacy contract, that creates pressure on a front office to manage public optics instead of simply trusting their own eyes. It puts a young quarterback in a position where he can do everything humanly right and still be fighting a story that was written about him before he ever threw a professional pass. So let me ask the obvious question nobody wants to ask out loud. What exactly is the ongoing justification for treating draft slot as some permanent verdict on who a player is becoming? Draft position is a snapshot of group opinion, captured at one single moment, filtered through scouting biases, team needs that have nothing to do with talent, and internal politics that have even less to do with football ability. Half the most important quarterbacks in this league's history weren't first-round selections. Draft slot doesn't measure work ethic. It doesn't measure football IQ. It doesn't measure how fast somebody develops once he's finally inside a real professional infrastructure with coaches who know how to build quarterbacks instead of just evaluate them on a spreadsheet. Continuing to use that number to question a player's legitimacy months after he's earned real respect from the coaches who watch him every single day. That's not analysis anymore. That's something else, and I think most of you already know exactly what I'm pointing at. Now, let's actually talk about the quarterback room as a football decision, because it deserves serious treatment, and Deshaun Watson deserves to be part of that conversation with real fairness attached to it. I'm not interested in turning him into a punching bag here. Before everything that derailed his career, Watson flashed signs of being one of the most explosive talents at the position in the entire league. The arm strength, the improvisational instinct, the ability to read a complicated coverage and still create something out of structure when the play breaks down. That was never manufactured hype. That was real tape. The financial commitment the Browns made reflected a genuine belief that the talent justified the risk, and at the time, that belief wasn't irrational. But talent and availability are two completely different currencies, and Watson has had a brutal time staying healthy and consistent since his return to the field. Every single time it looked like momentum was building towards some kind of reclamation story, something else got in the way, and that pattern hasn't really broken yet. What Monken has said publicly about the day-to-day competition is genuinely worth sitting with. He's described it as a back-and-forth battle. Watson has a day where he looks every bit like the franchise starter he was paid to be. Then Shedeur comes in and does something that completely reframes the conversation. Then Watson answers. Then Shedeur strings together a stretch that's impossible to wave away. And the head coach himself has said plainly that both of these quarterbacks are capable of starting and winning games in this league. I want to push back on anybody tempted to file that under generic coach speak. A head coach who has watched two men compete daily for months with real professional consequences riding on the outcome does not say both of these guys can win in this league unless he actually believes it. That's not a hedge. That's a man being honest about a genuinely difficult problem he doesn't have a clean answer for yet. And underneath the daily reps, there's a deeper question that matters more than who wins a single practice period. Which of these two players gives this franchise the best realistic shot at building something durable? Watson carries experience and scar tissue in roughly equal measure. He's lived through postseason pressure, through moments that have broken far less resilient competitors, and through off-field events that would have ended most careers outright. That history is real and it matters. But Shedeur is carrying something that's genuinely hard to manufacture artificially: momentum. He's trending in one direction, and it's up week after week. He doesn't carry the accumulated weight of everything that's happened during Watson's time in that building. He's fresh, he's hungry, and he's building real chemistry with the people around him in real time, not on a 4-year-old highlight reel. In a franchise that is, by any honest description, in a rebuilding window, trajectory can matter just as much as peak talent. A player on a sharp upward climb can sometimes be worth more to an organization than a player with a higher theoretical ceiling who's been knocked off his rhythm by everything outside of football. Now I have to shift into something darker, because this next part of the story is where I think the coverage has genuinely failed people, and I don't say that lightly. I want to talk about Brandon Sorsby. Andrew Barry stepped out and made a public statement on this, and the center of that statement leaned heavily on grace, on the idea of redemption, on not reducing a young person down to the worst decision of his life. And look, I want to be clear before I go any further. I'm not here to be cruel toward a 24-year-old who made a catastrophic choice. I believe people are capable of doing something terrible and still deserving a path forward as human beings. That's not where my problem lives. My problem lives in what actually happened, stripped of all the softening language: gambling violation, integrity breach, language designed to make something deeply personal sound bureaucratic and administrative. What actually happened is that a professional athlete placed wagers on competitions inside his own sport, outcomes involving his own team, his own teammates, and, by some accounts, bets placed against those same teams. I need you to actually sit in that for a second, because the meaning isn't abstract. It means there were stretches of time where Sorsby was standing in that locker room calling those men his teammates, while somewhere across town there was an active financial position that paid out specifically if those teammates lost. There was a real, lived moment where his personal financial interest and his team's success were pointed in opposite directions from each other. Coach Prime said something about this that I genuinely don't think I could improve on if I tried. He said that when you're grinding every single day, in that weight room, on that practice field, sacrificing your body for a group of men you trust, and you find out one of those men had money riding on you losing, that's not a rules infraction. That's a betrayal. And the reason that word carries more weight than violation is because football, at the level these guys are playing, runs entirely on trust in a way people outside the sport rarely fully grasp. A receiver runs a route through a dangerous window because he trusts his quarterback to put the ball exactly where it needs to be. A lineman grinds through a play where he'll never get credit because he trusts that the man beside him is pulling in the exact same direction he is. The instant that trust gets contaminated, the instant there's even a possibility that someone inside your own walls might benefit from your failure, the entire structure becomes fragile in a way that no scheme adjustment, no coaching change, no halftime speech can repair. And here's where the contrast with how Shedeur has been covered becomes something I can't just quietly skip past. Shedeur Sanders did everything right. He absorbed a humiliating public draft slide with professionalism instead of bitterness. He walked into a building where the incumbent was protected by a massive financial commitment and earned a genuine competition anyway. He built real relationships with coaches and teammates, and those relationships keep surfacing in honest, unscripted ways because they're actually true. And the national conversation still has him defending a character question that the facts stopped supporting months ago. Meanwhile, a player who allegedly bet against his own team gets a public organizational statement built around grace and second chances. Both of those instincts might be defensible in total isolation, but put them side by side, and the gap in standards is loud enough that I don't think it can be left unsaid. And then, the legal side of this exploded and made everything heavier. The Big 12 Conference filed a complaint in federal court directly against Texas Tech's decision to keep playing Sorsby while the gambling investigation was still active. That filing came with real teeth attached, reported threats of financial penalties, and possible exclusion from the conference championship game. And then the Texas Attorney General stepped directly into the middle of it, signaling that any sanctions the conference tried to enforce would be met head-on with legal pushback from the state itself. So now you've got a conference, a university, a state government, multiple legal teams, and a 24-year-old quarterback all tangled together in federal court, fighting over what the integrity rules of college athletics are even supposed to mean anymore, and who actually holds the authority to enforce them. What struck me most about the Big 12's decision to skip the NCAA entirely and go straight to federal court is what it quietly admits. It's maybe the most honest signal yet from inside college athletics that the NCAA's old enforcement structure has effectively been gutted. Court loss after court loss over recent years has stripped that organization of the ability to enforce its own rulebook with any real confidence. Schools challenge rulings and win. Injunctions get handed out almost routinely now. The whole disciplinary framework that used to hold college sports together has quietly eroded to the point where everybody inside that world already knows it doesn't function the way it once did. The Big 12 bypassing it entirely is the clearest sign yet that conferences now believe they have more legal footing to enforce their own bylaws than the NCAA has to enforce anything at all. Whether that belief actually holds up is exactly what this case is going to determine. But underneath all of that legal complexity sits a principle that doesn't shift depending on who technically has enforcement power. You protect the integrity of competition completely, or you quietly accept that every other integrity rule you try to enforce afterward gets weaker because of the exception you allowed here. There's no version of this where you soften the line on gambling and still expect to keep credibility on anything built above it. The floor underneath gambling enforcement has to hold weight. The moment it becomes negotiable, wrapped in grace narratives, delayed by legal injunctions, complicated by political interference from a state government, everything stacked above that floor becomes structurally unstable. This isn't a new lesson. Sports has learned this the hard way, repeatedly, across different eras and different leagues. And every single time somebody convinces themselves they've found a good enough reason to bend that rule softly, they end up proving exactly why the rule needed to be rigid in the first place. So, where does that leave everything when I try to hold the whole picture together at once? Shedeur Sanders didn't write the story that's been following him into the league. He inherited it. The draft coverage, the scrutiny, the character question marks that got attached to his name through a process shaped as much by perception and politics as by actual football evaluation. None of that originated from anything he did on a field. And he's been carrying that weight every single day since he walked into Cleveland, doing it without complaint, without deflection, without a single piece of the behavior the original narrative predicted he'd show. The people who actually watch him every day keep saying the exact same things. The competition is real, the growth is real, the chemistry is real, the evaluation, internally, remains genuinely open. And somehow, none of that has been enough to move the national conversation, because that conversation is running purely on its own inherited momentum now, completely disconnected from what's actually happening on the ground. The Browns are going to have to make a decision soon, and yes, At its core, it's a football decision. Watson's experience against Shedeur's trajectory, the sunk financial cost against the upward curve, the known commodity with real durability questions against the young quarterback who's earned every inch of this through actual work in front of the people grading him. I won't pretend there's an obviously correct answer sitting out there waiting to be discovered. But I know what the people inside that building keep saying, consistently, without prompting. And at some point, every single person involved in this, the front office, the conference offices, the national media voices shaping the conversation, has to decide whether they're going to trust the truth in front of them or the narrative that's louder. Because the truth doesn't come with a microphone attached by default. Somebody has to choose to hand it one. And how that choice gets made, by everyone with a stake in this story, is the real test of what people actually value once the stakes get heavy and doing the right thing starts to cost something. The next few months are going to tell us plainly who's actually willing to face that test honestly.